Hey everyone, welcome to SingularityComputers Client Build 8, Part 4. The name of this build is Cytotoxic. At the end of the last video, I assembled the front panel and completed the front panel mods. In this video, I'm going to start work on the rest of the water cooling loops, but before I can, there's still a lot that needs to be done. Since the last video, I've installed the power and reset buttons and front panel connectors. This was difficult because, as you can see, there's only a small gap over the top of this radiator. I've also installed a fill port for the graphics card loop. Now around it I've installed a 1/2 inch grommet. This was just to clean things up, to close up the gaps around the fitting. I'm going to use a number of these fittings around this build. They're really handy when modding because they basically allow you to take a water cooling loop straight through a panel and out the other side. Now you can see I've installed the 360mm radiator onto the mid plate. Previously in the build log I talked about a problem that I had with the noise blocker E-loop fans. In pull, the fan blades touch the radiator, so I had to install them in push, and I had the same problem. The fan blades actually touch the mid plate. Now I could change the shape of the mid plate, but this means dismantling the case, cutting and repainting the mid plate. There's no way I'm going to go back and do that now. People have mentioned gaskets and washers, but none of that is really going to work. A gasket might, if it was perfectly shaped to avoid the fan blades of the noise blocker E-loops, but because the blades come so close to the outer frame, I think there would still be problems. So I've decided to swap the fans, and I'm also doing this to improve the aesthetics. In the bottom compartment, I want everything to be black so that it blends in and doesn't distract from the rest of the build. So the fans I've decided on are Noise Blocker Black Silent Pro PL2s. I use these fans often in my builds. They're a silent fan and the aesthetics are going to be perfect for this system. At this point you can see I've installed the AX1200i. I'm not going to cover this power supply in this build log. I'll probably cover it in a future video. I'm just about to go through and get all of my cable lengths because, as you might have guessed, I'm doing custom wiring in this build. I'm going to customize and sleeve everything. Now, different people are going to have different ways of doing this. I like to use a piece of wire, preferably a larger gauge. This time I'm using 18 gauge. And I just lay the wire into position. It's important that you take your time when doing this, because if you make a mistake at this point, it can mean a massive amount of work for nothing. Once I get the wire in position, I mark off my length with my thumb or finger, and then I lay the wire down onto a ruler and write down all of my measurements. I'm now going to install the two OCZ Vertex 4 256GB SSDs. I'm going to configure them in RAID 0. I'll include performance results towards the end of the build log. This is another great thing about the TJ11. You have 3 positions for 2.5 inch drives down the back side of the 5.25 inch bays. It's clean, it's out of sight, and it's easy to wire up because it's only a short distance from the motherboard. The SSDs are now installed. I'm now going to move on to the installation of the pump and reservoir configurations. Okay, I assembled these previously in the build log. As I've already mentioned, I'm going with dual loops in this build, and I'm going to talk about that in detail coming up because I get a lot of questions about the benefits of dual loops. I'm going to mount one pump and res config onto the back panel. I'm going to have to remove the back panel to drill some holes for it. The other pump and res config I'm going to mount to the 360mm radiator in the 5.25 inch bays. And I'm planning on using a couple of UNZ2 brackets to mount it. I have a lot of other mounting options that I might also use. It just depends which mounting option is going to give me the correct positioning. I want the pump and res configs to be centered between the 360mm radiator on the mid plate and the top panel, and I also want them to be as close as possible to the side panel. So I've now finished mounting the first pump and reservoir. And after going through a whole bunch of different mounting configurations, what I've ended up using is EK uni holders. The UNZ2 brackets just didn't give me the exact positioning that I wanted, and also the strength wasn't that great. So I have 2 EK uni holders at the bottom, which I've bolted to the 5.25 inch bays with 4 M3s. I've then bolted the pump bracket to the uni holders with 4 M4s. And the strength just with the lower brackets was definitely good enough. But still, I've included another top bracket, so another EK uni holder bolted to the 5.25 inch bays with a single M3, and then an EK reservoir mount. Now, I may not even end up using this top bracket. It just depends if the fittings surrounding the pump and res configs are strong enough to hold them in position. I would much prefer if I didn't have to use the top mount, because the aesthetics are going to be a lot better without it. Okay, I've now done just about as much work as I can on the water cooling loops until the replacement fans arrive that I've mentioned. I'm not going to talk about the loops in detail until I have completed them. So far, to the graphics card loop, I've connected the fill port to the top of the reservoir. I've also connected the top of the res to the radiator in the 5.25 inch bays. I've changed both of the reservoir tops from the single opening version to the triple opening version. This is something that I've talked about previously. I've done a fair bit of work on the CPU and motherboard loop. I've actually completely changed the crystal link configuration between the CPU and motherboard water blocks. As you can see, I've decided to go with a serial configuration for the CPU and motherboard loop. I still may go with a parallel configuration for the graphics card loop, but for this loop, there was no parallel configuration I could think of that didn't destroy both aesthetics and performance. It was just too big and bulky, too much tubing, and basically I just couldn't split the loop at a place that would improve the performance by improving the flow. It is something I need to talk a lot more about. But anyway, what I have in mind for this loop so far, the pump and res is going to sit in here, as I've mentioned. I'm going to drop straight down through the mid plate into the 480mm radiator, into the top of it, then out of the bottom of it, and that's where the drain port is going to be, and that's going to go straight out through the back panel. Then I'm going to go up through the section that I've just built into the motherboard chipset, CPU and MOSFET water blocks, and then back to the top of the reservoir. So a nice, clean and short little loop. Anyway, I'm now going to move on to the installation of the second pump and reservoir on the back panel. The first thing I need to do is get the positioning of it, because I want to match it up with the other pump and reservoir. So to get the positioning for the rear pump and reservoir, the first thing I needed to do was get some reference points to measure from accurately. I then masked up the back panel and marked off where I needed to drill the holes. Now I just need to remove the back panel. I'm now drilling the 4 holes for the pump and reservoir. I'm actually supposed to drill a 5th hole for the EK reservoir mount, but I'm not going to, and I'm going to remove the one from the other pump and reservoir. I'm now drilling the hole for the fill port. It's actually supposed to be 20mm, but I'm using a 10mm drill bit because a 20mm drill bit just chews the material. I then file the hole out to size. You can get an incredible amount of accuracy with a file if you take your time. You can see that the hole is almost perfectly round, and I now have the bits power fitting in position. You can see that the hole is perfectly sized. I actually masked up this panel before I started working on it. There's no way I was going to lay it down on my bench without the back of it being masked up to protect it, so that's something that you need to do. I now have the pump and reservoir mounted and the fill port connected, and the connection to the fill port alone definitely gives this config enough strength, so I don't need to use the extra EK res mount. And there's still 2 connections to make for the inlet and outlet, so by the time I finish the loops, strength is definitely not going to be a problem. You can see I've used a rubber anti-vibration gasket. This actually comes with the Bits Power mod kit. And just a quick look at the back panel, you can see the black M4 button head Allen key bolts that I've used blend in nicely, and at the top you can see the fill port. I've now finished mounting both pumps and reservoirs, and I'm really happy with the strength of the mounting systems and the positioning of them. The only difference between the two is the one at the back is 10mm closer to the windowed side panel than the one at the front. And I had to do this because it was too close to the motherboard. You can see there's about a 20mm gap between the pump top and the fitting there, and I wanted to make sure the memory was accessible. I could have moved it out about another 10 millimeters, but I didn't really need to, and I wanted to make sure that the difference between the two pump and res configs didn't become too great, because then it really becomes noticeable. And actually it's a little bit noticeable now, mainly from this angle. You can see the pump and res config at the back actually looks slightly lower than the one at the front. This is certainly not the case, it's just because it's slightly closer. So when looking down from above, you can see this. The reason I didn't move out the pump and res config at the front is because the mounts don't allow for it. It would then be, outside of the 5.25 inch bays. You can see I've removed the EK reservoir mount from the top of the reservoir, and as I mentioned, that's just because it's certainly not needed. The strength of those fittings is far greater than the strength of the EK reservoir mount. So you can see the loop that I've built down here so far is a good distance from the pump. I needed decent spacing down here because there's still a lot of fittings and tubing that I need to install, and I also still need to install the fans on the radiator on the mid plate. Just a quick look at the back panel. Now this fill port will need to be used with a bits power 90-degree dual rotary fitting or similar. Then it will be easy to fill with a syringe, or preferably one of those funnels with a G1/4 inch thread. Phobia actually makes them. That's probably what I'm going to use to fill both of these loops. Okay, I'm now just going to elaborate on what I talked about in the last video about how restrictive the new EK graphics card water block design is when it comes to multi-GPU water cooling configurations. What I want to go for in this build is a bits power Crystal Link parallel configuration between the graphics cards. But the only real way I can set up a parallel configuration is with the EKFC bridge triple parallel. Now I did mention there is another way. I could use T-fittings, and this is a bits power T-fitting, but I'd actually need 6 of these on these 3 graphics cards, and it would be very bulky and crowded. The aesthetics would not be that great. I had a number of comments. People said I should use the EKFC bridge single. With the graphics card spacing I have here, it's not possible to use the FC bridge single because I'd need 3 of these, 1 on each graphics card water block, and they would actually butt up against each other. They touch each other, so you cannot put anything in between them. Now, they are handy for a single graphics card or graphics cards with a larger spacing. For example, if I removed the middle graphics card, then the FC bridge single would allow me to set up a Crystal Link serial or parallel configuration without any 90-degree fittings or other unusual fittings, and it would look great. What it comes down to though is that even with a single graphics card, to get the input-output options of the old EK graphics card water block design, you have to purchase a separate FC bridge, the FC bridge single. And then with multi-GPU water cooling configs, well, there's a lot of options there, but you're really being pushed in the direction of the EKFC bridge. Anyway, I'm not saying it's bad or good either way. I'm just putting the information out there. I'm not actually going to decide what I'm going to use for the graphics cards until I build the graphics card loop, so I'm going to leave that for now. Okay, before I cover the wiring, there's a couple of important things I need to talk about. Recently in the Client Build 6 build log, I did custom wiring, and I decided not to cover it. And I had a lot of people comment. People wanted me to cover the wiring. And because so many people commented, I decided, and I mentioned, that I would do future videos, a series of videos on custom wiring, and also a series of modding videos. I definitely still plan on doing that. The thing is, I also said that I would cover wiring in future build logs. But in this build log, again, I'm not going to cover the wiring. There is a good reason for this. There's a certain way I do things. I provide as much detail as I can. And even a beginner's wiring guide, I really need, it's going to be about a 45-minute video and probably split up into a couple of parts. And that's just the very beginnings of it. And there's no way I can integrate that into a build log. I really need to dedicate videos to wiring. I just don't want to skim over it in a build log. Now, this is something I really need to cover in a subscriber video, and I'm planning on doing one coming up. A lot of you will have noticed the gaps between my videos are getting bigger, and this is because I'm becoming increasingly busy. Currently, I'm working about 12 to 16 hours a day. I've been looking for somebody to come and help me at Singularity Computers for a long time now. I have had people employed in the past, but that was different. That was before I started my channel. Now my primary objective is my channel, sharing information. At last I found somebody who I can trust. That's the big thing with me. I just don't trust anybody to uphold the level of quality that I want. And I've actually never let anybody else work on my builds. What I'm getting at, these cables are the very first time I've worked with somebody on my builds, and the guy I've found does an excellent job. He's been a big fan of Singularity Computers right back since the beginning, has a keen interest in modding, and it just so happens that he's a retired electrician, and what he's best at and interested in doing is custom wiring, which works out well for me because it's extremely time consuming, takes up a lot of my time, and yeah, this is going to save me a lot of time, and it's going to mean that the gaps between my videos get that little bit smaller. Anyway, what we've done so far is the 24-pin motherboard power and all of the 6-pin PCIe. The 3 GTX 680s need 6 6-pin PCIe in total. And we've taken the stock cable kit from the AX1200i. We've shortened all of this wiring. Because of the design of the TJ11, the back I/O panel faces the top. It means that the 24-pin and all of the PCIe doesn't need to be anywhere near as long because it drops straight down through the mid plate to the power supply. So we've shortened everything, and to do that you just need to dock it off to length. Then you need to strip the ends of the wires, crimp new pins on, sleeve the cables, and put the connectors back on. And the sleeving we've used is $1 Million PC black. And as you can see, we've done shrinkless sleeving. We haven't used any heat shrink. Some people like it, some people don't. I absolutely love it. I think it looks incredibly clean. And personally, I find it a lot easier to do because you don't need to worry about lining up the heat shrink, which is, difficult to get the heat shrink all at the same height. One thing you do have to make sure of with shrinkless sleeving is that you get good attachment, that the sleeving is not going to pull off or pull down, but if it's done right with the technique that we use, there is absolutely no problems with durability whatsoever. The pin is going to pull off the end of the wire before the sleeving is going to pull down. Now the AX1200i is a bit of a nightmare to sleeve. Basically almost every single wire crosses over. You pretty much don't have a single wire that goes straight through. And not just on the 24-pin, on all of the wires. The PCIe, there was wires crossing over. There's 2 wires going into 1 pin all over the place. And there was actually one on the 24-pin where 2 wires went into 1 pin. And this is okay as long as they go into the same pin on the other end, but they didn't. They went out to different pins on opposite sides of the connector. And when you're sleeving, this is the last thing you want. You want all of the wires to line up, to go straight through so that it's nice and clean, and yeah, so that everything lines up. But despite all of that, I'm extremely happy with the way this wiring has turned out. This is only really the beginning. There's still a lot of wiring to be done, and there's actually a lot of wiring that we're going to need to make up in the build for the lighting and the fans and all of that. But it's now time for me to get this installed. Okay, I've installed the cables and also the 360mm radiator back onto the mid plate, and I'm really happy with these cables. We put a massive amount of time into them, and custom wiring can be a nightmare, but it's always worth it in the end as long as you put in the necessary time and effort. It's not just the sleeving and how well it's done that improves the aesthetics. Also, customizing your cables to length means a massive improvement because you don't have all of that unnecessary cable length to deal with. And if it's all done right, the cables just fall into position. And what I mean by that is I've just plugged these cables straight in. I haven't done any cable management yet whatsoever. There's certainly no cable ties or anything like that. And that's just because the cables have been cut down to length and they've been properly sleeved. So this is not really the final routing, because I still need to install the fans on the radiator on the mid plate, and that's going to mean that the cables have 25 millimeters less room to bend down and around the radiator, so it's going to push them up a little bit more. And that's when I'll do the final routing, line up all of the individual wires. But I'm really happy with how it looks now. This is basically, I showed you earlier how I get my cable lengths, and this is exactly how I bent the piece of wire around into position before I measured it. So I knew that I was going to route the cables like this. And actually, the reason I went back and made another cut in the mid plate, you can see the 24 pin, how it bends off to the left, and it kind of follows the curve of the PCIe power. This is because it needs to go down and around the power supply. And basically, once I installed the radiator onto the mid plate, I realized there just wasn't going to be enough room for cables. So that's why I went back and changed around the mid plate. But anyway, there it is, and that's it for now. That sums up this part of the build log. In the next part of the build log, the fans will have arrived, so I'll be able to get them installed and get the 480mm radiator installed, and then all of the water cooling components are in, so that means I can actually completely build the loops. So that's what I'm going to focus on in the next part of the build log. That sums up this video. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe, like and favorite if you want to see more.